Welcome to Ex Terra Extra. I'm Tom Patton, Chief Content Officer for Ex Terra Media. And joining me as always on Ex Terra Extra is Mike Turner, the CEO. And today's discussion is going to focus on rapid changes in the commercial space industry with private corporations like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others that are really pushing the envelope. So what are we going to be talking about here today? Well, there's a balance that has to be struck between innovation and regulation, and that's going to be really a fine tightrope that has to be walked between not only the government but the private companies who are working in commercial space. We'll also look into the recent legal shifts that are impacting the space industry and the role of insurance. And anybody who, like I do, lives in Florida understands that insurance can be quite the issue. Well, it's quite the issue for space as well. All that's coming up on Ex Terra Extra, Mike, and it's great to have you with us again.
Good being here, and glad to see that you survived Milton.
We did. A lot of folks in Florida were not quite so lucky, but here where I am in Northeast Florida, it was about like a strong nor'easter, and we get those a lot. But I've got my thoughts and prayers go out to everybody down to the south of us in the I-4 corridor who really got hammered by Hurricane Milton. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yep. Let's talk about some of the rapid growth that the space industry has seen over the past few years, which has led to a really complex relationship between regulatory bodies like the FAA and private companies. There's obviously been some tensions between the FAA and SpaceX. We've got those pretty well documented, and we'll get into all of that in just a little bit. But really, Mike, what's kind of going on is that the companies want to go fast, and the FAA, being a government agency, is not built that way.
That's true, and government is cautious. Nobody wants to. Well, it's a giant case of cover your you know what. Mm-hmm. But here we sit. This is we're recording this on the 12th, and we are presumably upon the eve of the next Starship test flight. And though as of right now, there is no permit from the FAA. However, SpaceX seems to be thinking it's pretty imminent, and they have been correct in the past that the permit would be imminent. So, and there's been an awful lot of brouhaha about getting this license, and this is the Starship is the perfect example. SpaceX is ready to go. The FAA, not so much, and some of the environmental groups, not so much. However, the news is that the Texas, I forget what the Texas environmental, what was it, Texas Coastal Environmental Agency or something, who had given a fine, I think, to SpaceX. They're okay with everything. So that's all been given the go-ahead. It's all just been waiting on the final issuance of the license by the FAA. But it brings up the issue of when is regulation too much regulation, and when is it not enough? The interesting thing right now is there really isn't that much regulation on commercial space. Now, everybody thinks there is. There isn't. The FAA has been given authority by the United States Congress to regulate the launch and recovery of commercial spacecraft. It does not affect U.S. military. It does not affect NASA. But it does for commercial spacecraft and launching or recovering from the United States. And that's all covered under 14 CFR Part 400, or actually more specifically Part 450. And interestingly enough, they have been Congress, when they gave them the authority, told them you can't make a lot of regulations for 20 years. Well, that's been extended, and it's
more
been
than
extended
once.
now. Yeah, more than once. Yeah, and it's out to
2025
now. Yeah, and so The FAA can't actually make a lot of regulation, and the intent of that was for the industry to figure out what it was doing, because how do you regulate something if you don't know what you're doing yet? And they're working these things out, and every time they launch, they're finding out more and more things, and certainly what's going to come out is some regulation that will follow some industry standard as it gets developed, and you will start to have some actually meaningful. I'm a big critic of government regulation as anybody, but you will have some meaningful regulation come out of it that will make sense before the crazy stuff comes out. And we'll see how all this evolves. But in the meantime, the likes of Virgin Galactic have had run-ins with the FAA. Blue Origin has. It's not just SpaceX. They just happen to be getting the big attentions on the headlines. But where do you draw the line? The government genuinely wants to protect the public. They both obviously people and property. And it's part of the charter. Space companies want to get going. They want to get get their missions going. They want to start making money. They want to start getting a return for their investors. And we as a society want to reap the benefits, as we have been doing in advances from space. And so we have we have this trifecta of companies wanting and investors wanting return on their money, the public wanting the benefits of the commercial space industry, and the government trying to keep everyone safe. And it's always a tension between the three, and it's a never-ending battle. So here we are. Do we have too much regulation or not enough? Arguably, we're actually pretty good right now. I would say that the FAA is just, I don't know, I guess in my opinion, they're just a little too cautious right now. Maybe in 5 years, when they have a lot more operational experience, the industry has a lot more operational experience, I think, at that time, the regular, you'll have real regulations that make sense, and everybody will know what the rules of the game are. Right now, we're still making it up.
It's interesting, Mike, because it seems like commercial space got lumped into the FAA because the government didn't know where else to put it. And they do operate in what's known as the national airspace. You and I have both been aviation geeks for almost as long as we've been. And the national airspace, the rockets go up through the national airspace. They come back down through the national airspace. And that's why it got lumped into the FAA. Probably what's going to have to happen somewhere down the line is there's going to have to be, I think, a separate regulatory body that deals in space. Because while you've got the FAA regulating the launch and recovery, the launch and reentry piece of it, the Federal Communications Commission has a big say in spectrum allocation for satellites, for communications between spacecraft. And when that starts getting out into a more of a cislunar as opposed to just an Earth orbit situation, then you're going to have to start seeing an agency that has expertise specifically in space to really focus on those issues and take care of them, in my humble opinion.
I kind of look at that a little differently. I look at it as the way we're doing space right now. Let's talk about orbital space. Let's say maybe even geosynchronous orbit and below. That's just an extension of airspace. And airspace, how countries have evolved the regulatory framework to allow airlines to fly, literally, is ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And within that, there's an internationally recognized set of rules. When you go, if you fly from Los Angeles to Moscow to Beijing to Tokyo, to Sao Paulo, to Cape Town, to Mumbai, no matter where you go, the runway markings are the same, or virtually the same. The way airspace is categorized and carved up, there are some local nuances, but for the most part, it's the same thing. And this has all been reached via international agreement over the years, and it's something that's truly planetary. And I see why, like you mentioned, you're going up through the National Airspace System and launch, and you're coming back through it in recovery. And that's true for every country wherever you're launching or recovering space operations. And so to me, it is kind of a logical thing that the aviation industry is going to become truly the aerospace industry. And I still wonder when the Federal Aviation Administration is going to become the Federal Aerospace Administration. And I see that happening, and all this will definitely, if you're going to be in Earth orbit, this is just in my brain how I make sense of it. If you're in Earth orbit, it'll follow under the ICAO type of thing, the space version of ICAO, whatever that may be. And now you're talking about like cislunar space and lunar space. After that, I think it's going to be the Wild West. I think there's going to be some international agreement and all that, but who the hell is going to be enforcing that?
That's true.
Great. We have an outer space treaty, and we have all the folks who love to get together and talk about space law and all this other stuff. And then I watched I love The Expanse that was on. It ended up on Amazon Prime. It started on Sci-Fi, but I think that is the purest vision of probably where we're headed. We're going to have Earth, we're going to have the Martians, and we're going to have the Belters, and they're all going to have their version of stuff. And how are you going to enforce it? You're going to have space cops pull people over. Right? It just doesn't work that way. The physics doesn't allow it. So it's going to be it is yet to be invented beyond Earth orbit. But within Earth orbit, it all completely makes sense to me that you just extend the ICAO system out, because it's already there and it works. And we have to modify it for the likes of space debris and space traffic and things like that. But that's just an extension. It's a higher you're just dealing with higher altitudes, and that's an easier problem to deal with than it is. Okay, how are we going to deal with moon traffic? How are we going to deal with Martian traffic? Well, we don't have that problem yet, and we're not going to have it for a while. Lunar traffic over the next quarter century? Yeah, probably. Martian traffic? Well, yes, some, but let's face it, it's an entire planet. It's not like, I don't know, Elon Musk, maybe he's going to get 10,000 ships to Mars. The way he's going, after seeing the We Robot presentation the other day, I think he is going to get it done here. But, it's a very interesting thing, and I don't know that we can even talk about regulation beyond Earth orbit. I mean, other than just conceptual things at this point, because we ain't there yet.
Well, let's bring it back down to Earth, because there have been some legal shifts over the course of the past year or so, most specifically the Supreme Court striking down the Chevron defense. Now, for those folks who don't know what the Chevron defense is,
it's deference.
It's a deference?
Deference.
What did I say?
Chevron. You said defense. It's Chevron deference.
I intended to say deference, and then I didn't. Be that as it may. On the Chevron
senior moment,
and legitimately so. When you get into the Chevron deference, that came out. The case dealt with fishing vessels that were required to have someone from the government on board the vessel for, I guess, to make sure they weren't catching the wrong thing, or who knows why they were there. And the vessel owners and operators were required to pay the salaries of the government officials who were on board their vessels to basically cause them a lot of problems. And got challenged and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not right. And that's going to, I think, have a big effect on the kinds of things that are going to be happening in space, because now what that says is that government agencies can't create regulations that are enforceable. It has to be there has to be a lot more congressional oversight into those regulations that affect things like fishing vessels and now space.
Yeah, the getting into a little bit more detail on that, because it's the nuance that's important on this.
Right.
Because the case you were talking about there, the original case that created the Chevron deference was Chevron versus the National Resources. What do they call the National Resource Defense Council? And they had lobbied Congress to, they were worried about, as oil companies were doing offshore drilling, that,
right,
they didn't want certain fish species hurt and things like that. So they got the government to write regulation under certain laws that already existed, but they got the government to write regulation to say that, you're going to require, you need to have these people on board the craft. You have to do this. And so they wrote regulation. And Chevron took that to court. And the Supreme Court in 1984 said, what we're going to do is we're not legal. We're not experts in fishing and all this kind of stuff. And the government hires experts to do that. What we're going to do is Chevron's made its arguments. The government's made its arguments. What we're going to do is we're going to defer to the government that they have expertise in what they're doing. And so in this case, we'll believe what the government is telling us. Well, fast forward another 40 years. Now we have this administrative state, and we wonder, where do all these regulations come from? How does regulation grow so fast? Well, the deference basically gave administrative agencies free license to kind of invent what they wanted.
Right.
And that's what the case was this year in the Supreme Court. They challenged the Chevron deference, and they said to the Supreme Court, it was argued, the Chevron deference is unconstitutional because Congress, under Article 2, is tasked with creating legislation, not the administration, which obviously, as the executive, is only to enforce it.
Right.
And in fact, federal agencies, by deferring to the administrative agencies that are enforcing the law to make the regulations, they are in effect creating de facto legislation. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's right. And that violates the separation of powers, which is one of the most fundamental legs of the Constitution. And so the Supreme Court struck down the Chevron deference. Now, what will this mean in the future? I think there's going to be a lot of lawyers that are going to be very busy in the future. But in the meantime, what's happened is, I just saw this the other day, and it was in relation to a different legal topic, but there was already a number of cases in federal court where suits were going on, and when the Supreme Court struck down the Chevron deference, that was new evidence for the various cases. And the bottom line was there was a number of cases that were dismissed because part of those cases were relying on the fact that the administration could create these regulations willy-nilly. And when the Chevron deference was struck down, a lot of these cases were thrown out of court. This had nothing to do with the oil industry, the space industry, or anything else, but it foreshadows what's coming for the administrative state. They can't just create regulations for whatever the popular political will is at the time. And that's very disturbing to some political groups because that's how they've managed to get some of their wish list done. So what does this mean for space? Well, it means that the FAA can't just go out and willy-nilly make regulation. Now, there are already There's a moratorium on doing too much on regulation. And I don't know how it's all written, but even when that moratorium comes off, it means that the FAA can't just create a regulation just because some industry group says, oh, you guys should make a regulation for this, that, and the other. No, if Congress wants that done, go lobby Congress.
Right.
And, Congress has to, as the Supreme Court says, the Congress has to do their job. You can't give your job to the administration and tell them do my, let me go out here and party hardy, while I'm raising campaign funds and go do my job for me and create regulation. No, Congress, you got to do your job. So the Chevron deference could be huge, not just for the space industry, but certainly for how law is done in this country. But for the space industry, what it means is the Congress either will have to be very involved, or if they choose to be hands off, then the industry won't have that much regulation. So there are political battles yet to be fought on all this. Stay tuned. It'll be interesting.
And of course, what that did was it gave a lot of power to unelected administrators in Washington who didn't have to answer to anybody. They had no voters to answer to. They just did whatever they wanted. And so you're right. If Congress decides that they don't want to, or don't have the expertise, or don't have the time, or, we've all seen, and we mentioned this in an article, that Congress can't even pass a budget in any kind of a timely way. And that is their primary function, is to create a budget for the United States. They can't do that in a timely way. How do we think they're going to have enough expertise to look at these very, very technical things that deal in space and come up with meaningful regulations? That's going to be a huge, huge challenge. And if they're not allowed now to turn to places like the FAA, where there may be some of that expertise, or even, NASA's not a regulatory agency, but that's where where that expertise might come from. We may see the Wild West here, not just in cislunar and Martian orbits.
Well, that's true, and I think what has been lost on modern society, and I don't know. I love reading history, but I'm certainly no historical expert by any means. But somewhere over the last century, we've gotten this idea that only government can do certain things. And it's because the government and politicians have told us only the government can do certain things, until after a while we think, oh, only the government can do certain things. When you look at it, the founders weren't idiots. They made it hard to make legislation. And if you ever read any of the history of the Continental Congress, oh my God, you think today's Congress is a circus? Those guys, they were, oh wow, Congress has not changed. The nature of Congress has not changed in 250 years, a quarter of a millennium. It has not changed. And you go back and you see how they squabbled during the Revolutionary War and during the Articles of Confederation with the Continental Congress, and you look at it today, there's no difference. Yeah. Maybe the language is a little different.
There are fewer fist fights.
There was I think one congressman did kill another congressman back in Henry Clay's time or something, like in the 1830s or 40s or something. It was crazy. We think today's politics is wild. I read some history. but anyway, the fact of the matter is it's not meant for legislation to solve every problem. And my personal favorite, at least for the industry, is industry standards. And why I like industry standards is people in the industry compete with each other. Right. And so therefore they don't want the other guy to have an advantage. But on the other hand, they have it in their vested interest to keep their costs low and to keep their risks low. In fact, how you keep costs low is keeping your risks low. And with industry standards, you know, standards aren't the end all either, and they're not meant to be. They're meant to say, today we shall do it this way, and then until you find out, oh, well, that wasn't a good idea. So today we shall modify what we were doing, and we're going to do it this way. But what happens is you're able to change. You don't just change on a whim. The industry has to go, you know what, we got a problem here. We better take care of this. And it's sort of a self-correcting thing. And your automobile, there's federal regulation on it, but there's also the Society of Automotive Engineering specs to it. And right. You could just go on and on and on about all these different industry specs that go into your automobile, far more than probably any of the automobile regulations by any federal agency. Those standards are how your car really get built. You know, the federal government, okay, yeah, there's somebody to deal with. But industry specs, they're what really make things go. And I'm a big believer in them, mostly because when things go wrong, they can be quickly changed. And it's done by industry experts. Now, those who don't trust industry say, well, it's all an insider's game. Well, maybe it is. But, you know, those guys, they don't want to lose money.
Right.
And that means they don't want to kill a lot of people. That means they don't want to, you know, the greed is good in that case, is to quote Gordon Gekko. You know, it's the industry standards become a great way to start to regulate things. But what keeps the industry itself in check, which I think brings up our third segment.
I think it does, because we're going to talk about insurance, which people think about insurance, and I mentioned this at the top of the show. We're living in Florida, and I got to tell you, we got the company which shall remain nameless, arbitrarily and capriciously, in my humble opinion, after I've been sending them money for the last 25 years, decided to cancel my homeowner's insurance because I live within 5 miles of the ocean. Now, okay, we saw what happened with Milton, and Florida has always been a big, you know, there's always been a lot of risk to write insurance in Florida. And that brings up the point, is that there's a lot of risk to write insurance for something that might blow up before it reaches its final destination. And we've seen that happen more than once. NASA actually has a program for high-risk missions that companies can get involved with at a lower price, simply because they're riding on experimental rockets and they might not get where they're going. So insurance is going to be one of those things that is going to become, in some ways, a regulator of the industry, because if the insurance companies won't write insurance for your mission or your satellite or whatever it is, you're not going to be able to do business.
Yeah, and that's kind of the crux of it, is an insurance company is literally an independent third party that is there to make money for their investors. And by getting premiums from people who are doing risky things, and then making sure those risky things don't go bad. And what you know, and as they say, money talks. And right. The insurance companies, they become de facto regulators. Tom mentioned that Tom and I've been in the aviation world for a long time. We're both pilots, and there are things that the federal aviation regulations allow you to do, but your insurance company won't. And the effect on that is, though it's perfectly legal from a law standpoint, certain things in aviation, you can't get insurance for it. And so certain things aren't done simply because the insurance companies aren't going to insure it. So you can talk regulation all you like, but here's a case where if the insurance companies don't do it, it doesn't get done. And so they become a de facto regulator, but they're looking at it purely from a risk reward standpoint. What is the reward for the risk? And if there's a lot of risk, I'm going to charge a big premium. Can you afford it? Does it fit into your business model? Is the payoff for the premium you have to pay so big that it's worth the risk? Go for it. If it's not, then you probably don't have a good enough business model for the risk that you're taking. Simple as that. How does Elon Musk create the world's biggest, most powerful rocket? Something that's literally a flying atomic bomb, though it's not atomic, it's chemical. And everybody cheers for it. It's because the potential for this thing is phenomenal.
Right.
Because it lowers the cost at the holy grail, the promise of of low cost launching, which he's proving with the Falcon 9 system. And others are starting to get there. They'll start to catch up. He will start to get some real competition. It's still going to be a little ways away, but he's going to start getting some real competition. But the Starship, he's going to have the heavy lift capability. He's going to have the 747 cargo plane. He's going to be able to move goods into space like nobody else can. And if you can do that, then you can get the things into space and you can do it affordably, where you can get returns on it. And we've already seen the wonderful stuff that you can get out of space, whether it's GPS. They've set up the Starlink, all the controversy about the Starlink stuff and all the FEMA politics and everything else. Well, Starlink, getting things, they can instantaneously turn on communications around the planet. It's just phenomenal. Like I said, after watching the We Robots thing the other night, with all the new stuff that Tesla's coming out with, I mean, somebody had mentioned we're at an inflection point, and he's laid the groundwork on so much tech that the takeoff from here is going to be phenomenal. So naturally, the Tesla stock went down yesterday. So never let Wall Street dictate what's going to be really successful in the long term or not, because Wall Street only looks at the next quarter. But anyway, it's a big deal. Insurance, if you can get insurance for it, and that insurance is affordable, you're doing something right. And if you're trying to do something a little too risky, the insurance companies are going to say, well, either we're not going to underwrite a policy for it, or it's going to cost you big time. And in some ways, I think the insurance companies are the final arbiter, because government, this thought that the government is a neutral arbiter, it is not. It's highly, highly political, as we've seen in the last few years. But the insurance companies, they don't care. They're just money beasts. It's risk and reward, and they become they're like gravity. They're a very harsh arbiter. Gravity doesn't care. Gravity just says, I'm here. you figure out how to land softly.
Yeah.
I'm just here. That's the way the insurance companies are. It's you want a policy, here's the price. And unless you can convince me that you can land softly, and then maybe I'll lower my premium. So anyway.
And obviously insurance is going to be a crucial thing as space moves forward, as the space industry moves forward, but probably it can't replace formal regulations, because there is no enforcement other than cancellation of policies or refusal to write policies. It's the only enforcement mechanism that they have. And so there is still going to have to be formal government regulation of some kind for the space industry to be able to thrive. Now, whether that comes in the form of standards, and I think, Mike, we're talking about standards beyond like a docking port, so that everybody's manned, human-rated spacecraft can dock with everybody's human-rated space station. But there's also going to have to be standards in a lot of different areas that the insurance company will look at those standards and say, do you comply with these standards? Then maybe they'll be more inclined to write a policy, but it's not going to be the be-all, end-all of regulating the commercial space industry.
No, it's not. However, I do predict a standard coming up, which will be you can design your spacecraft the way you want. You can design your spacesuits the way you want, but thou shalt have cross compatibility with other people's spacecraft, so that
Gee, what could have brought that on?
Yeah, Starliner. It's I think there's a perfect example of. I think that people are thinking right now, okay, what happens? This is not going to be the first situation where you have two different spacecraft with two different spacesuit systems, and yet they've got to somehow you've got to one may rescue another. So the spacesuits. Ooh, standards are coming. Standards are coming. So,
well, Mike, we are out of time for this edition of Ex Terra Extra, and it's just one of those topics that there's not an answer right now, obviously, because the industry is still in such a state of flux, and there are so many things to be learned. And again, as we mentioned in a recent article, by the time that learning period ends with the FAA, what they've learned may be entirely irrelevant. So that's where I think there's going to be a real issue, is with the government and regulatory agencies keeping up with the technology. I think that's going to be their biggest challenge.
Oh, I think so too. The tech is just it's accelerating in what it's doing. And by the way, for everybody's information, the articles that Tom's referring to is Navigating the Space Between Regulation and Innovation, which we published on October 4th. And on October 5th, we published the article Legal Shifts in the Future of Space Regulation, which is where the bulk of this conversation comes from. If you want to come and take a look at those articles, that is premium content. You do need to be a paid subscriber to read that, but that's just some of the stuff that we're digging into here on the Journal of Space Commerce.
All right. Well, we are out of time, Mike. So thanks very much for taking time out of your Saturday to record a podcast with us. And it's always a pleasure to talk with you about these issues on Ex Terra Extra. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Tom.